This meeting is being recorded. Your face will not pop up on the screen unless you are unmuted and asking a question. Please remain muted for the duration of this call, as this is a Zoom meeting, which means if you do make noise, your face will pop up on the screen. And because it's being recorded, if your face pops up on the screen, then everyone will see you. But those are just a couple housekeeping notes, and I just want to welcome you to our fourth week of the Lenten series, Ramadan in a New Country. The purpose of this series is to better examine our own spiritual practices as Christians during the month of Lent and to understand the culture of those that we're hosting. Many of the folks that join this call or watch the recording later are hosting Afghan migrants that came into the country over the fall and are seeking to learn more about how to be welcoming and inclusive to our new neighbors. And I certainly appreciate that you are taking the time to do that and that you are doing all the work that you are doing to welcome them with dignity. This final week is going to be a little bit of a touchy subject, and that is racism in the refugee resettlement system. And, you know, just because it's a difficult subject doesn't mean it's not one worth exploring. And in particular, we're going to be talking about racism and what it has to do with Islam and how it evolved and what it looks like now. And so to go ahead and start us off to talk about that conversation, I'm going to be showing you another segment of the video Discovering Islam that I have shown you segments of before. I know several of you have requested copies. We actually ran out of them at the office. I do have more at my home office, and I did receive your emails. I do have you on a list. I will get them to you just as soon as possible. So the segment that I'm going to be showing you right now to get us started into the mindset of how this topic is relevant to what you are witnessing in the homes that you are serving and what you can do to be supportive is the fact that a lot of Muslims feel marginalized due to being perceived as terrorists because of the world events of the last 25 years or so. So I'm going to go ahead and let the video speak for itself, and pray for me that I'm able to pull it up successfully. It doesn't always want to pull up by itself. So hold on one moment while I grab it. There we go. Can everyone see it? Can someone get off mute and say yes or no?
Yep.
You can see it. Okay, great.
I have a black screen.
Well, as soon as I press this, it should start. And please let me know if you hear it as soon as the sound starts, which will be in just a moment. Okay, just confirming everyone can hear it, correct?
I don't hear anything, no voice saying.
But you hear music, right?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah. I'm sorry, the person speaking is not audible.
Regardless of their faith.
Okay, is that true for everyone? You can't hear it very well.
True.
True.
Or whether they practice a faith,
How about
who
now?
would immediately say these are
Yes.
extremists
Yes.
and therefore be distinguishing it from,
Yes.
if you will, the religion of Islam or mainstream Islam. However, if you don't know anything about a faith, then you don't make that distinction. And I think that's...
Okay. Let me back up a little bit then so you can hear it.
These terrifying images bring tears to many people's eyes, especially to Muslims' eyes. For Muslims, the pain is twofold, that innocent civilians were killed so mercilessly and that such heinous acts were done in the name of their religion.
When you look at the 9/11 attacks, it seems to me that it is self-evident to people who know the religion of Islam and its history that this is what I call a hijacking of Islam. If you're somebody that doesn't know anything about Islam, then that's not the case. You know, the response is both intellectual as well as gut. The fact is, if the attacks have been committed by Christians or Jews, people in their gut, your average American, regardless of their faith or whether they practice a faith, would immediately say these are extremists and therefore be distinguishing it from, if you will, the religion of Islam or mainstream Islam. However, if you don't know anything about a faith, then you don't make that distinction. And I think that's part of what we've had to struggle with post 9/11.
I'm going to pause that here and fast forward here. Find it.
Militant Muslim theology, militant Jewish theology. And regrettably, people like Pat Robertson, Franklin Graham, Jerry Falwell, the Reverend Jerry Vines, and many others engage in that kind of exclusivist theology. They therefore condemn the other. And many of them will condemn in the past Jews, other Christians who aren't reborn or born again the way they would like it, but they particularly now focus on Islam and Muslims, and I think that's enormously dangerous. I also think it's enormously unchristian.
In such an environment of negativity toward Muslims, American Muslims became the targets of this negativity. American citizens became the victims of discrimination and prejudice. Hate crimes against Muslims grew exponentially. Islamic institutions such as places of worship and schools received threats of violence as well as bomb threats, and many institutions were attacked. Muslim individuals, men, women, and children were threatened and harassed.
On our website, we were not used to getting any hate mail at all. If we were to get any hate mail once a year, that was a big deal. But of course, after 9/11, the floodgates were open in terms of hate mail coming in. After we started getting these hate mails, we responded to each one of these hate mails, trying to explain to people that people should not look at this incident as projecting the religion Islam.
the first day after September 11th, we went back to school because we already had scheduled one day off for teacher meetings. But that day I was actually sitting in class and a guy started talking about it, about September 11th, and said that the world should go ahead and take care of all Muslims and Arabs. Just get rid of them and that would solve all of our problems. And so I turned to him, and I mean, he was a classmate, he wasn't really a friend, and I told him, well, you know that I'm both Muslim and Arab. And he said, well, then we should start with you.
This is not the only example of an American citizen being harassed. Other American Muslims were accosted with denigrating statements such as, "Go back to where you come. We don't want your kind here. Your religion teaches hate. You people only stand for jihad, holy war, and killing."
Holy war? Killing? These concepts are not consistent with the teachings of Islam. And what does this term jihad mean anyway? Jihad has become a very popular term that has been used and abused. The term jihad has been used to mean something negative, that this term advocates warfare and the killing of non-Muslim people. The true definition of this term, however, is completely different.
In the West, the concept of jihad has been seen as a violent struggle by Muslims against non-Muslims. Historically, the concept of jihad is not like that. Scholars would tell you that the term jihad comes from the word jahada, which means to exert an effort in the good and positive sense. To be a good father, to be a good scholar, to be a hard-working individual, to bring food for your family, to struggle also for justice in a just way.
All right, so that that segment from Islam, a Faith Hijacked, is meant to help you get into the mindset of the way that Muslims feel that they're perceived when they come into predominantly white Christian countries like ours, and the type of behavior that they have to endure on a pretty regular basis, especially when a world event happens. They know that they're personally going to be targeted by the repercussions of whatever that event is, even though they don't agree with it and they feel personally aggrieved that these sort of actions were carried out in the name of their own religion. As the video mentioned, it is doubly harmful to them, not just because they are being harassed for something they didn't do, but also because it speaks personally to the way that they believe and what they uphold in their values. And that's a really hard place for them to be. So every single Muslim I've ever met feels this way, in that they feel like they are unnaturally aligned with this idea that Islam creates terrorism and that it is a violent religion, and that they have a personal story of someone saying that to them. You know, that's a place to start when working with your families, is knowing that that is something that is present in their minds when they're talking to you, is they're wondering if you are going to perpetuate this sort of stereotype against them and if they're safe. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the PowerPoint presentation that I have and run through the rest of this material with you. Okay, as I said, the video again is Discover Islam, and if I'm not able to get the video to you fast enough, if you've requested it for me, they also have a website that you can order directly from. I've talked to them and they're aware that we're doing a series on this using their material. And this particular video is called Islam, a Faith Hijacked. There's 4 different series in this box set. Okay, so let's get into it. Is racism and Islam in the refugee resettlement system? As I've mentioned in previous topics from the first week, is that the reason why this matters, not just for the family that you are hosting, is that 70% of the world's refugees right now are from Islamic countries. So it's not just folks from Afghanistan, but also predominantly folks from Syria or Myanmar or Iraq or Palestine. All these places are also predominantly Muslim and produce a large amount of the world's refugees. You know, in the United States, we often hear about the border crisis because we are a secondary country to the border. And I'll explain what I mean by secondary country. But actually, most of the refugee crises happening in the world are currently happening in the Middle East and North Africa. And so that's why you see a lot of this is there's crises happening in those countries. And a lot of that stems from terrorism happening in those countries. And then the Muslim populations that are fleeing that terrorism. They're not part of the terrorism problem. They're the ones that are being directly killed. Most of the folks that are subjects of Islamic terror are actually Muslims. It's Muslims that try to go against whatever terrorist regime has decided to co-opt their government, or Muslims that had done some sort of thing that didn't fit into the fundamentalist ideologies of those in power. So Muslims would tell you that they are also victims of the current state of Islamic violence. Now, as I've mentioned in previous videos, this is not the caricature of the way Islam has always been. And this is really important to reiterate, is that currently 70% of the refugees of the world are from Islamic countries, but this has not always been so. The most current refugee crisis that we're seeing is actually coming from a Christian country. Things can sway all the time. This crisis of Islamic countries producing refugees is only about 30 years old. And a lot of that has to do with U.S. and other types of colonialism destroying the environments that they hold and creating pockets of space for terrorism to take place. I think it's pretty well known that Osama bin Laden was trained by the CIA. And that's not to say that his actions were justified against attacking the United States. It's all an interwoven problem, is that the United States and other imperial forces invade countries that had become weaker after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and then dislocated the culture, the religion, and the values of those countries. And now we see the process of those countries in the Middle East and North Africa attempting to rebuild who they are, which is always a messy process. Predominantly white Christian countries went through the same process in the 1500s, in which the Protestant Revolution broke down the cultural and religious standardization of Europe. And you saw just years and years of war happening in Europe that created refugees at that time. And then, of course, the refugee crisis of the mid-century was of Christians who were militant using their power to kill Jewish people. And the refugee crisis of that time was Jewish people fleeing predominantly Christian countries. The sway of refugee regimes does not always stay static, but right now it just happens to be that Islam is in a really important time in its history in which majority Islamic countries are making big changes to who they are and what role they want to play in the world, and they're going through jihad or struggle in which they are attempting to sustain their own empowerment in a lot of ways. We saw that with the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring that happened about 10 years ago that produced the Syrian crisis was an outcome of these Middle Eastern countries wanting to take their power back, take their culture back, and provide new meaning for themselves using a different framework. And of course, that ended up producing a lot of refugees. But you just see that the way that these cycles happen, it's not in a void. You know, Muslims didn't just come out of nowhere saying that they are going to go take over the world and destroy everybody. There's always a context, there's always a story, there's always a history behind the way that things happen and people do what they do. And again, the majority of people that are suffering under these huge changes that are happening in the Islamic world are Muslims. And so they appreciate support and welcome rather than being analyzed for terrorism, which they literally are analyzed for terrorism when they enter the country. And that's part of the racism of the refugee resettlement system that we will go over. Now, I did mention Syria and the outcome of that refugee crisis. That is a significant way in which the refugee resettlement system has changed in modern history. The Syrian refugee crisis was the biggest, and continues to be, they continue to be the highest number of refugees fleeing in the world is Syrians. And this has been true for almost a decade. And it changed the way that the dynamics of the world happened because the outpouring of refugees from Syria was so great that Western countries were not sure how to receive it. And continues to be so great, especially since Syrians don't speak the language of the Western countries. They don't share much in common with the culture or the religious values. And so a lot of the changes that we see in the refugee resettlement system structure happened around the time of the Syrian war and also beforehand. Much of the history of the way we see refugee resettlement unfolding right now is due to 9/11. Also, a crisis of Western, predominantly white Christian countries trying to understand what to do with the migrant patterns of Islamic countries. So after 9/11, we saw a lot of changes in the refugee resettlement system, also after the Cold War. And those changes are basically that we went from being asylum accepting as a country and as a world to being security oriented. So most of the policies and procedures that we see taking shape and shaping the refugee resettlement system are security oriented rather than asylum oriented. And I will go over in a couple slides about exactly how that happened and why it matters for the way that the behavior of your families will be right now and how you can support them. But basically it comes down to merit versus credible threat. Credible threat is considered to be the only reason why a person can claim asylum in a third country. I was talking about secondary and third countries, also a secondary country. A secondary country is a neighboring country to the country where a crisis is happening. So our secondary countries are Central America, which is why we hear a lot about them. But the secondary countries to where most of the refugee crisis in the world is happening are in the Middle East. So Turkey and Jordan have more refugees in those two countries than the rest of the world combined, for example. But so in order to gain asylum under the international refugee resettlement system, as it has been since the 1950s, is you have to claim a credible threat that your life personally was threatened. And you have to be able to demonstrate evidence that if you go home to your country, you will die. And this is the only way that you're allowed to claim asylum in a secondary or third country. However, like I said, massive changes have happened to the refugee resettlement system following 9/11 and following the Syrian war, and that it created such a massive amount of refugees that we're looking more at policies of merit rather than credible threat as a but what has become the evolution of the refugee resettlement system. And again, I'll talk a lot about why that happened. Okay, so by the way, this is a photo of Al-Zatari, which is one of the world's largest refugee camps. It's in northern Jordan, and people have been living in this camp for a decade. And because they have no means of moving out of that camp, I don't know how many thousands of people live in that camp, tens of thousands at least. But they have no means of moving out of that camp because they can't demonstrate the credible threat that their life is directly threatened. And the longer that they stay in that camp, the less they're able to prove that, right? So if you've been living in a tent in this refugee camp for 10 years, it's hard for you to pull out photographic evidence of the time that, ISIS came to your house and threatened to behead you. That's exactly what you have to be able to prove to be able to be processed out of that camp. So there are just millions of people living in camps just like this that are sitting on their haunches because they can't claim this very specific credible threat that was created as a demarcator of how to become a refugee in the UN Refugee Convention of 1951. So after World War II, the world came together and said, wow, we really messed up the Jewish crisis, didn't we? Right? And so their proposal of changing that was they created this system that specifically spoke to that problem. So again, in order to become an asylum seeker, and an asylum seeker gets processed into a refugee, so I'm going to use these terms interchangeably for the purpose of this. In order to be granted asylum, you have to be able to hit the markers of what in 1951 was considered the demarcator of what makes you a refugee, and they were basing that on the Jewish refugee crisis at the time, the European Jewish refugee crisis, and that was that you have to claim that you are personally going to die because of religious or political persecution. That sounds very specific to what we saw happen in the Holocaust, right? But it's not specific to the migration patterns we see now. Yet that's never been updated. It's never once been updated at all. So every single asylum seeker that goes into Belarus, every single asylum seeker that goes into Turkey, every single asylum seeker that comes to the United States, Canada, everywhere has to claim this very specific thing that was created based on the situation that happened in the 1940s and has not been updated. That's problematic in a lot of ways because most of the people that are migrating in the world right now can't claim that their life was directly threatened. They can claim that they would have probably died eventually because the countries that they're fleeing from had bombings happening at random all the time, or there was famine, or there wasn't any jobs, or right, there's tons of, or there was a climate crisis, thinking of Haiti. There's lots of reasons why people migrate now that weren't true in the 1940s, and none of those things are taken into account in the refugee resettlement system. So what happens when you have millions, and we have a huge migrant population now. There are more people migrating now, forced to migrate now, like they don't feel like they can stay in their home country than there ever has been in history. And so what happens when you have more migrants trying to flee their homelands, then you are able to process with this very specific idea in mind that, can you show me photographs that this person tried to kill you? What happens is that you see policies just changing on their own without any sort of structure to them. So across the board, what we see happening in Western countries is, including the United States, is that we have decreased asylum processing and we are increasing our security policies. So the United States has canceled its asylum processing altogether. This began with the Clinton administration in the 90s. And then, of course, we see it ramped up is that Obama upheld that. So did President Bush, both of them. And then, of course, Trump was very explicit about making sure that policy was upheld and that we're going to decrease asylum and increase security. And now we literally have a policy in place that the Biden administration upholds that's called Title 42 and the Migrant Protection Protocols, which means that anyone seeking asylum from the southern border in the United States, which aren't just Central Americans, people fly in from all over the world in order to seek asylum at the southern border. In order to seek asylum in the United States, you have to stay in Mexico for an undetermined period of time while your case is being processed. Now, this goes against the 1951 UN Refugee Convention. The UN Refugee Convention says everyone has a right to claim that they were religiously and politically persecuted, and they have a right to remain in the country where they are claiming this asylum goal until they've been finished processing. That is all the UN Refugee Convention says. They can stay in the country that they're claiming asylum in while the claim is being processed, but the claim has to show that they will die if they go back home. And we're not doing that as a country, and we are not doing it because of The language used is for the protection of migrants, and that there was too many migrants coming to the border. In order to protect them, they expelled them back to Mexico, which isn't actually logical in my opinion. And it also is because of COVID-19 was used as a reason for this policy, and that it would be safer to keep all these migrants in Mexico rather than letting them in the United States. Even though the United States had, through most of the pandemic, had higher levels of COVID-19 than Mexico did. But basically, we see variations of the same policy all over the Western world, in that Western powers don't want to process asylum anymore, because the myriad of ways that the massive amount of people that are in forced migration, and the myriad of ways that reasons that they're migrating is too much for Western powers to want to process. And so instead, they just increase their security policies across the board. And that, is largely due to, world events that happen, including 9/11. It comes out of a place of fear, instead of a place of willingness to meet the needs of the times. But basically, the problem that we're seeing here is just that there's never been an update to this system. And so people are just kind of doing whatever they want, which makes a lot of room for discrimination. And that's how we see the racism coming into play, is when you kind of make up your own policies about how you want to deal with asylum seekers, because the rules have all changed and no one gave you a new set. You can determine what kind of refugees you actually want, and you can make up reasons about why you want them. Our hearts definitely go out to the Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, and we at UCC National, wish them empowerment and wellness. But this is also a good example of this, is that it's much easier to process a white Christian refugee from the Ukraine into a Western country than it is to process a Syrian who doesn't speak the language, doesn't understand the culture, and comes from perceived terrorism. It's a very different process between what the Ukrainians are experiencing and everyone else. Our border policies right now are that Ukrainians are actually exempt from migrant protection protocols, which again is being expelled into Mexico while waiting an asylum hearing. Ukrainians are the only population that are exempt from that. Arguably that's unfair to all the different populations that are fleeing for various reasons. And that is open to conversation. Again, I totally understand that what is happening in Ukraine is awful, and Ukrainians need safety just like everyone else. But the problem is, how do we define just like everyone else? There is no definition of just like everyone else. The UN Refugee Convention is outdated. It's specific to something that happened 80 years ago. And we don't have the language to know how to process new types of refugees that are unfamiliar to us. So this is called the triple trauma paradigm of what refugees go through when they come to a foreign country. Again, I talked about secondary and third countries. A secondary country is the middle part where you see migration. It's where they do the crossing in order to find safety. And as you see in all three of these points, the country of origin, the migration process, and the resettlement, all three of them say discrimination, racism, discrimination, racism, discrimination, racism. Because when people decide to, are forced to leave their homes and go somewhere else, there's always going to be questions about, do you really deserve this? And this is the main question that refugees are asked all the time. Do you really deserve this? And, to be fair to Ukrainians, Afghan refugees were also treated the same way, in which there was scrutiny over, why do you deserve this over Venezuelans? Why do you deserve this over Guatemalans? Why do you deserve this over Syrians or Haitians or, Congolese folks? Where do we draw these barriers about who gets safety? Because we did airlift 100,000 Afghans in the United States, and the government justification for that was that it's our fault that their country fell apart in the way that it did, right? And so that's a giant I'm sorry to the Afghan people, which is well deserved. But at the same time, where is the line? The United States has done a lot of similar types of imperialistic takeovers of many countries, including lots of the ones I just listed. But it's just all on this swinging system of who's deserving and why. And so that's kind of what the refugee resettlement system has created is who deserves to seek safety, why do they deserve to seek safety, and can we cherry pick about who's going to be the easiest to take into our country. So yeah, anyway, this triple trauma paradigm shows you that there's 3 points of trauma that they go through. And if you want to join our trauma-informed care talks that happen on the second Tuesday of the month, we go more in depth into this kind of conversation around trauma in those meetings. But I do know that experts that have handed this paradigm to me always say that the resettlement is the hardest part. The resettlement is the hardest of these 3 parts. And the reason for that is because they are in a new country and they are facing that racism, facing those cultural changes, and told that they're probably not good or deserving enough to have gotten the things that they've gotten. And why don't you just go back home? This is the message that a lot of refugees get, especially from Islamic countries, or not especially. People have all their different reasons why they have been subject to persecution or racism. But folks from Islamic countries in particular, have been subject to being believed that they are terrorists and that all the terrorism that happens in the world is their fault. And again, it's a pendular system. Right now, yeah, there's a lot of Islamic terrorism in the world, but that's because Islamic countries are going through a lot. That has not always been true. There's also been Christian terrorism. There's been Jewish terrorism. There's Buddhist terrorism. There's, Marxist terrorism. There's lots of different ways that people try to gain power over each other when countries are falling apart. It's not particular to Islam. So speaking of that, I wanted to give you this quote from the Dalai Lama. He said this maybe 5 years ago, is that the Dalai Lama himself said that refugees should go back home. And there is the article about that, as he was talking about how, European and Western countries should welcome refugees and help. And the Dalai Lama is a refugee, right? He has been most of his life. And that they should, I'm trying to get the rest of that in. There we go. But he did say that after they get stabilized into Western countries, that's not where they belong, is that the culture of Germany should be German, the culture of Sweden should be Swedish, and refugees should go back to where they came from once they can. Now, this was not a well-received statement across the refugee resettlement system, but it does bring food for thought coming from a religious leader and a refugee himself. And so that's a conversation that we should have as an international community, as a national community, about what are our expectations about cultural assimilation? What are our expectations about maintaining our own culture and our own values and the way that we place that onto the people that we're serving? And do refugees actually thrive in culturally similar countries? Now, the data on that question is actually mixed. So again, most of the countries that accept Islamic refugees or refugees from Islamic countries are Islamic countries themselves. So Jordan and Turkey have most of the world's refugees in the whole world, and they are Islamic countries. Now, it is good for refugees who are Muslim to be able to be in their own environment that they understand, with halal food, a culture they understand, a language they understand, plenty of mosques, the call to prayer, everything familiar. They're able to get back home pretty easily. But the problem is that countries like Turkey and Jordan don't have capacity to take any more refugees. The entire country of Jordan is a big refugee camp, basically. Only I think some 10% of people living in Jordan are actually Jordanian. Everyone else is a refugee from somewhere else. And so if Western countries aren't stepping in to share some of that burden, aren't stepping in to be able to help countries like Turkey and Jordan to be able to process people into safety, it just creates more problems in those countries. if they don't have the capacity. The United States and other Western countries do pour billions of dollars of aid into countries like Turkey and Jordan in order to help. But at the end of the day, having a more structured system that can burden share is what the term is called across scholarly resources on how we can change the refugee resettlement system. If Western countries can help burden share in order to take in some of the housing needs, some of the electric needs, some of the food security needs and school needs, there's so many things that go into resettling a family into a new country that is Turkey and Jordan alone can't do all of it by themselves, right? So, like I said, the data is kind of mixed, in which it is good for refugees to be in a culturally similar country, but it's not good for refugees to be crammed into situations that further expose them. And another problem with keeping people in camps like Zatari over here, or other camps like this, because that's the way that countries like Jordan and Turkey are dealing with this, because that's all they have capacity to provide, is that these camps do become breeding grounds for radicalism and terrorism. So, and let me explain that. So, as I said, Muslims are not terrorists. The majority of Muslims think that terrorism is wrong. They think it's more wrong than you and I do. But when you've lived in this camp for most of your life, and you've been told by countries that have better capacity to host you that you're not good enough, you're not deserving enough, then that will not do good things for your head or the head of the peers around you. And so by expelling, and this is also true in the southern borders, that we see increased levels of human trafficking, terrorism, and violence happening because of the MPP policies, Migrant Protection Protocol policies, is that when you trap people in encampments like this that aren't sanitary, aren't safe, and are substandard, when there are other options available, that increases radicalism and terrorism, because this is not a mentally sound place to have to exist. So policies that increase security for Western countries actually increase the probability of terrorism. Yet we still do it yet we still focus on these security-centered policies because we perceive that as easier than just putting more effort into our original dedication to be refugee welcoming, asylum welcoming, and processing people as we promised to in the UN Refugee Convention of 1951. And the reason why we won't do what's logical, because what would be logical is putting more money into the asylum system, more effort into figuring out how to do what scholars call burden sharing, and less emphasis on security that actually creates less security. There's lots of research on this, yet countries don't do that. Why? Because we like what's familiar. We like what's familiar in all aspects of our lives. It's considered that a white Christian refugee would be less of a hassle, right? Because, I put this photo up here of this nomad from Afghanistan who is getting ready to migrate. Just imagine, I'm, a white Christian, and having a conversation with another white Christian is going to be much easier than talking to this nomad, not just because of the language barrier, but because this woman's life story is probably way drastically different than anything that I could imagine. And so Western countries imagine refugees that can assimilate better, that would understand the jobs and the culture and all that other stuff that we've been talking about. And then they wouldn't have to deal with them anymore because they've already assimilated, much easier to do. But it shouldn't be a qualifier for merit. That's not part of the Refugee Convention of 1951, which is our only marker. It's our only marker on how to do any of this. There's no other rules for how we process refugees other than what happened in 1951. But people do qualifiers for merit anyway. Like I said, Ukrainian refugees are the only type of refugee that is currently exempt from the migrant protection protocols. And my guess is that's because it's easier to process Ukrainian refugees into the country than it would be to process folks that have been through a diversity of other experiences that would be harder to understand. And a lot of countries do this, is these qualifiers for merit. You know, with the Syrian crisis, it was quickly realized that Syrians were drastically different than the white Christian host countries that they were fleeing to. And so they began creating these security policies, creating these barrier policies so that they didn't have to process them. And we see this uniformly true. Same thing with Cuban and Haitian migrants, is that there was a policy in the 90s or the early 2000s called wet foot, dry foot, in which, you know, if a Cuban was coming over on a boat and they got their feet onto land, they were allowed to claim asylum. But if they got caught in the boat, they'd be turned around and sent back to Cuba. This policy did not apply to Haitians who did the same thing, because there's no uniform way to address any of this. We can pick and choose who we want to come into the country. And that is, in my opinion, a very unfortunate way to do this process. It is unfair to everyone involved, including our own country, is that, you know, America, we call ourselves a nation of immigrants, and there's a lot to be learned from indigenous cultures. There's a lot to be learned from foreign cultures. We aren't right in everything we do. And growing is part of the innovation that made America this great, beautiful country, is that we were willing to grow and innovate and integrate different cultures, you know, with dignity and value. And we can continue doing that, but we don't, because it's not as easy. And racism, just point blank racism. As I mentioned, security-oriented refugee resettlement actually decreases security. And so it's kind of this revolving door of, we see migrant protection protocols increasing human trafficking and gang violence. And we say, look, there's human trafficking and gang violence. We shouldn't let them in the country. When actually the asylum seekers are the ones that are subject to all of that, not us. And if we let them in to let them process appropriately like we promised to do, then that wouldn't have been a problem in the first place. So I left you a Bible quote about fear, and that's from Joshua chapter 1, verses 9. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Because what we see with all of this discrimination in the refugee resettlement system is fear. It's all out of fear. We hold up these borders because we are afraid of what would happen if we put them down. And then we see our fears being realized by the policies that we create. And so I thank all of you for being willing to welcome Afghan migrants and migrants from other populations that may not be as familiar to you, but you're willing to be uncomfortable and be present with them anyway, because that is a holy process of not fearing, not being dismayed, and knowing that God is with us when we do welcome the stranger, even if the stranger is much stranger than we had anticipated them to be. So this is the last slide, in that we're going to be going over this in May, and this is how to be anti-racist. I have a guest speaker coming to our trauma-informed care who specializes in anti-racism and how to be a good ally. And so they're from the Peace Center in Langhorne, Pennsylvania, and they're going to be coming and providing us tools and skills about how to be anti-racist, in case you would like to move forward with how to be a good ally with all of our refugees that are getting the short end of the stick in the refugee resettlement system that needs to be redone. Okay, and that's the end of our series, but I am open to questions and any further thoughts that you have on the series, or questions about Ramadan, Islam, or just the refugee resettlement system in general. Floor's open to you.
Irene, I want to start by just saying thank you. I have really appreciated these different sessions.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you attending, and again for the work that you do with migrants, Carol, out in Seattle. Sure, I can send those links. I'll add you to the mailing list. Yeah, Raina, do you have a question?
No, I've enjoyed it very much too, and very eye-opening. I appreciate all the work that you put into this and offering it, and our group has really enjoyed it. So I get in trouble if I don't get the link out soon enough. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you also for the work that you're doing in Pennsylvania.
I'm wondering where, I mean, obviously I would go to Google next, but I'm really interested in the triple trauma paradigm because our folks are in this resettlement part, and our family is going through everything under that category, to the extent that our dad's brother is still back in Afghanistan and is being literally hunted by the Taliban because our dad had worked as a medic for our country. And dad is beside himself, understandably feeling guilty that, his brother wouldn't be in this situation, but for him. So I just want to find out anything I can to help them through this.
Sure, and I can have a separate conversation with you, Lori, about that. That is a uniform experience. Probably everyone that has an Afghan family has someone that was left behind that's trying to get back or trying to get here. The answer to that is kind of unfortunate in that well, I'm just happy to have a separate conversation with you about it. There is a process. It's not a good one. I see Ron said white supremacy in the chat. Yes, indeed. As I said, a lot of the refugee problems that we're seeing in the world currently are the result of white imperialism, white country imperialism, and also white countries then blaming the refugees and categorizing them as what merit and deserving they have in order to migrate when we were the ones that created the problems in the first place. Including Ron's ministry, which is Micronesians. In the 1950s, we blew up Micronesia with test bombs, or 1940s we blew up Micronesia, 50s, 40s. We blew up Micronesia with test bombs and then gave them visas saying I'm sorry that aren't good for anything except for basically going to Hawaii and working there. That's another way in which US white imperialism destroyed another culture and created a refugee crisis. Yeah, John.
I'm with Mayflower UCC in Oklahoma City, and we're sponsoring 4 Afghan families and working with maybe another 5 families informally. And Oklahoma, which I consider one of the most racist states in the country, it's interesting. Our experience has been uniformly that everyone has been very welcoming and helpful to us as we help these folks integrate into the society. It's like kind of the upside of having people that are conservative and support wars and the Republicans and all of that end up in this case having a lot of really appreciating the Afghans that are here, and I just been pleasantly surprised at that. That's not what I expected.
Yeah. I mean, the sort of interesting part about Afghan migrants is that a lot of people all across the spectrum of political beliefs, were part of the war in Afghanistan, and so that's a kindred population to a lot of folks with military backgrounds.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, for those of you who dropped your emails in the chat, I will add you to the distribution list for future events. The next series that I'll be doing is going to be in late May, and it's going to be on this topic, basically, in that we're going to be talking about how to discern what your congregation can do to support different types of migrants, because there's so many different crises. Like I said, Ukraine matters, Palestine matters, Haiti matters, so does Micronesia and Afghanistan. They all matter. So how do we discern what type of migrants we serve in our churches, that our churches are called to serve, and when and why? And so that will be the focal topic for a short series that's going to happen in late May, which I will put out there.
One last quick question. Could you just post in the chat perhaps um, where we can access the past sessions? Because I would like to, I missed a couple of those and I would love to go back and watch the recordings.
Sure, of course. I have a web team that's actually trying to compile all of them so that I don't have to email them individually anymore. But for right now, yes, I will send you an email with the past links.
That's great. Thanks so much.
Okay.
And I want to share it with our team because some of this background would be very useful for them as well. So it's a good way for us to help educate our team members. So thanks.
Great. And I'm always available by email or phone. It's actually probably easier to get a hold of me by phone because my email gets wonky. Yeah. If you have any direct questions about something that's happening with the families that you're working with. All right. Well, thank you all so much for the engagement you're doing with Refugee Ministries. Like I said, we have our trauma-informed care that happens in the first Tuesday of every month. And the next series will be in late May on discerning what type of migrants to work with when there are so many different crises happening in the world. Blessings on all of you, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks so much.